Final word, Adam Collins with you. And down the line with me from Canberra is a man who I used to speak to every single day of my life, I think, for a time when he was the political editor of the West Australian. He's gone on to do that same job at the ABC. These days, he's the national political correspondent or something like that for the Nine newspapers and the Nine Network more broadly. Andrew Probyn, welcome to the Final Word.
Well, Adam, what a great delight to see your cheerful face again.
Used to be, I used to love, my job when working for Rudd and then subsequently Wayne Swan was to, do the laps of the press gallery each day. And you'd go and, the Paris end of the gallery was where you'd speak to the reporters at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. You might nip in and see Laurie Oakes at Channel 9, Mark Riley at Channel 7. And you'd sort of wander down towards your end, the other end, where the West Australian officers were yourself and Shane Wright and Nick Butterley and Andrew Tillett, and I'd always save that for last because it was the best conversation. We talked heaps of shit, and you'd never tell me what you were going to write.
Well,
it was worth it anyway.
We used to call it the Werribee end because for a long time we actually had a problem with the toilets that were opposite our bureau, and they used to spill over and make not only a terrible stink but a real stain on the carpet. Turns out that it was actually the ladies' lavs next door, not ours, from over flushing, and it was spilling into the gents. So we were getting blamed, but that's how we got the name of the Werribee end.
Happy memories. I remember Sky News was down there in their original little bunker with David Spears, Kieran Gilbert, Laura Jays, all that lot, that generation of reporters. And that's the generation that I was in Canberra for 5 or 6 years. Happy memories. And part of the happy memories I have from being in Canberra was our annual cricket match. And the reason I got you on today was that it's been a significant milestone this week, or it comes up later this week, but you've played a game yesterday to mark 40 years since Bob Hawke top-edged into his glasses, shattered his eye, and it played a big role in the 1984 double dissolution election. Now, for those who don't know, give a bit of a sense of what happened that day in the Pollies versus Press game all those years ago and how Bob Hawke found himself out there in the middle, getting injured in the end.
Well, look, the Pollies in the press gallery have been playing cricket together for a long, long time, or against each other for a long, long time. We reckon it probably dates back to the 60s and definitely into the 70s. Now, we know, and the only existing evidence of the earliest scorecard is actually featuring in the Canberra Times from the 15th of October 1984, and it's in reference to a game that was the day before. Now we can go into the significance of that particular event, October 15, but October 14, the then Prime Minister Bob Hawke had called, as you were referring to, a double dissolution election. So in Australia, that's both chambers of Parliament are dissolved, and they go to the people. Now, amazingly enough, given it was the day before and the election campaign started, which is why it's significant, he decided to have his annual Prime Minister's 11 versus the press. And in those days, I think, Adam, it was less about having Pollies play, but the best side possible that could be rustled by the Prime Minister. So you can always you can imagine it be all the young scallywag staffers who had some vim and vigour about them, rather than the crusty old politicians. But the central crusty old politician, Bob Hawke, fancied himself as a dab hand with the bat, and he was having a hefty swipe here, there and everywhere at Kingston Oval, which is here in Canberra. He was on about 27, 28 runs. It's actually slightly in dispute as to whether it was 27 or 28. But there was a fellow called, and I'm just referring to a paper here because a fellow called Gary O'Neill, who was the ex-Melbourne Herald correspondent, he was bowling at the time, and when we got this photo, it's a very famous photo that you could perhaps show your viewers, very famous photo taken by the Canberra Times photographer. You should ask me about the circumstances in which he took his photo. But Gary O'Neill was bowling the ball, and he'd been smacked here or there, and he thought, well, look, I can tell that Bob Hawke's going to have a swing because he thought he was a pretty good player. So he dropped. This is Gary O'Neill quoting. I dropped the ball a little short for a good. I dropped the ball a little short of a good length, and it rose up, but only just above waist high. He took a huge swing and top edged it up into his glasses, which instantly shattered, and his head rocked back. No helmets in those days. Blood was streaming from a gash near his eye, and I thought, bloody hell, what have I done? So
Well,
the
and he
Prime
very nearly,
Minister,
I mean, but he very
yeah,
nearly blinded him, didn't he? I mean, so the story goes, and it's well documented in the Labour in Power documentary that came out in 1994, that the glass did lodge in his eye, and that did require, I mean, he got back to the ground that day, but he had to wear the patch on his eye when campaigning in the double dissolution, and there was other events going on in his personal life at the time, I suppose. But it did play a role in I guess, the direction of that very important federal election, that the Prime Minister was campaigning with a patch on his eye due to a game of cricket that was, I suppose you would describe now as a bit of an indulgence.
a bit of an indulgence, but as you say, he was almost blinded by it because
Mm.
little did he know, but he had a piece of glass stuck, wedged between his eyelid and his eyeball. And the Prime Minister was about to wipe it from his eye, which would have caused
Oof.
enormous damage. And I think it was Jeff Kitney who was then another correspondent.
Mm.
So the press gallery journalist saved the day. Can you believe it? Adam Collins says, Prime Minister, stop there. He stops him from wiping his eye and therefore causing massive damage. And he plucks from his eye this great big shard of glass. And he was rushed off to hospital and on 28, not out, retired. But the story doesn't end there because, as I said before, the next day was actually the very first day of the election campaign. And the Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, was there with an eye patch. And they turn up down in Jervis Bay, which Jervis Bay, for non-Australian viewers, is a beautiful spot where there's a lot of naval activity. And let me read what Gary O'Neill says of that particular time. He says, the next day, the start of the 1984 campaign, the travelling media circus set off with a one-eyed Prime Minister for a media event on two of the Royal Australian Navy's new frigates in sea trials off Jervis Bay. Hawke got his own back when he insisted that I was the one, as in Gary O'Neill, was the one to be transferred at sea on a flying fox rigged up between two ships under full steam. And if you don't believe this, check this out on YouTube. There's a full video of Gary O'Neill frightened and knowing that he had been set up because of his own misdeeds before, being strung in the high seas, and it's pretty wobbly seas. It was on this precarious bit of rope. So great fun.
It says a bit about the way that the relations between the media and indeed the Prime Minister themselves. You hear of the good old days of when there was one plane and Bob Hawke's plane would be out the back smoking cigars and having drinks with the touring reporters. I mean, that would have happened even in the era when I was working with separate planes and separate transport. I don't suppose it's anything like that now with you and the current Prime Minister. But, Bob Hawke was of that generation. He's the only Prime Minister that I'm aware of who's got a cricket archive page, because back in the 60s when he was a union official for the ACTU, or 50s as well, I think, he was playing for the ACT. So he wasn't far away from, I guess, having what would be now described as List A status. And he came ever so close to getting a blue for cricket at Oxford as well in the varsity game, which he was 12th man for when he was a Rhodes Scholar. So, it sort of says a lot about Hawke the man and Hawke the character, that cricket as a player was central to his life, not just a guy who loved watching it or would turn out to the Sydney Test match and do a couple of interviews. Like, cricket was in his blood.
Totally, and we've seen it in the last few years of his life. Indeed, when he'd be challenged to sink, some beer in one, and he would always do it. Even in his 80s, he would see the camera, and they'd say the whole crowd at the SCG would be saying "skull, skull, skull, skull," and of course, he'd always oblige. And even when his He was there with an eye patch, and he was injured almost catastrophically, it must be said. He returned to the ground back in 1984 in his budgie smugglers, and sat in a banana lounge and watched the day progress. He loved his cricket, he loved his sport, and he loved his racing too. So a real character. Is it different nowadays? Of course it is. And I tell you, the big difference is the advent of the mobile phone. You've got politicians now who are really anxious about anything that they do being recorded and being judged upon. So we're in a much more censorious age, and the likes of Bob Hawke can be glad for it.
Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't around when that it was so easy to film. Like, that wasn't really a part of the job, even when I was there between 2007 and 2013. And look, these games have, they've got a history to them. I was lucky to play in a few of them. When I started playing, it was Steve Lewis who was running the press gallery team. I think you were his vice captain. Probes, you're skippering it these days. And there'd be a smattering of politicians playing, but typically, and Richard Colbeck, who went on to become the sports minister, was often the captain of the politicians team. But it would be staffers, as you say, and there'd be others who'd played a bit of cricket, like Kieran Gilbert, who played some district cricket up at Mossman from Sky
And
News.
still playing, I might say.
I'm sure KG's still playing, bowling his little Roger Harper sidearm off spinners, I'm sure, and giving it a whack and so on. But it's a convivial day. I also remember from that game that the Pete Vaness Trophy that it was named after the late AAP J, who was a great mate to all of ours, who passed away from cancer in it would have been about 2012 when he died, but was always someone who was one of the first to sign up to that game. And it's been over the years a chance for relations to be, I guess, civil in a building where it's often not, whether it's between the adversarial nature of the parliamentarians and the staffers and the media and the public servants, and then of course between the parties, whereas days like this are like genuinely wholesome and nice.
They are great, and they're really valuable. And for the young journos in particular, it's terrific to see politicians in a different setting. And there's no doubt that it actually helps the journalism and the understanding if people can acknowledge the fact that you're human and not just. And I'm talking on both sides here, from both politicians and the journalist side, to actually understand someone and have that connection. And sport is like that. Cricket is certainly like that. And I think I got to know you a lot better, Adam, when you were smoking me for sixes. I remember one day in particular. It wasn't actually your highest score, but I think it was 2010. Right. We were playing at Radford College, and I bowled a ball. I thought it was actually pretty good, just on leg, thinking that it would turn it towards first slip. And you saw it, you pounced on it, and you smashed me. And it wasn't the death rattle of the stumps being felled. It was the death rattle of having your ball, ricochet from building to building as it sailed over the boundary. So it was humiliating. So thank you so much. But I was looking up the stats actually, because cricket is a great game for statistics, and it's also a great game of history, as we know. And I was looking at some of your best innings, and I think it was 60 not out. I played in that game, but amazingly, because you had to retire at 50, or you still have to retire at 50 in this game, 60 not out. You guys scored quite a lot of runs, but we scored more. I'm very glad to say. Kieran Gilbert got 58 not out. Yeah. But you got 60 not out in a long innings. Yeah. But hardly anyone else got any runs, I might add.
I feel like the year before, my first time playing it was 2008, not long after getting there, and it was the first time the Pollies had won for a decade or something like that, and batting with a new young MP called Jason Clare, who had just been elected in Blaxland and was probably, I don't know, mid-30s and still played cricket. And he and I batted together for a long time and got us over the line in that game. And at the time, I think Phil Coorey, who was working for probably the Herald at that point, said, "That'll do more for you today than anything you've done politically."
Well, in that game, I'm looking at the stats again, so I can go to the stats book here. Adam, you got 53 not out. Jason Clare only got 24. Okay. But I'm looking at my bowling figures. They're horrific. 1 for 43, and that can't have been any more than like 6 or 7 overs. So you must have belted me for a few there.
It was good times. And the other thing about those games is the TV cameras always rock up, don't they? So they capture the first ball or the first few balls, and they always find a way of making it into the TV packages on that Sunday night. And I suppose it would have been the same for you guys yesterday, given it was the 40th anniversary, a bit of interest. So, I mean, what sort of politicians were out there playing in the parliamentary side yesterday? Was there any active serving ministers or anything like that, or shadow ministers?
Well, we actually have. Well, it's interesting on two fronts there. Actually, first of all, there was no media coverage. One of the reasons, of course, was October 7 being an anniversary, first anniversary of something else. So it didn't feature in any news, and that's totally understandable. But the irony to that is that we actually had more politicians playing than ever before. We had 11. We had 11 playing, or 12, because we played at 12, and we had 11 politicians. We had 3 Labor, about 3 Nats, and the rest Liberal. So, I'm looking at the list here. We had Michael McCormack, a former Deputy Prime Minister. He plays almost every year and has played when he can. Matt Canavan. We had Varun Ghosh, who is a new WA Labor senator. He very modestly said to me that look, he played a bit of cricket. He wasn't much good. Proceeded to get 50 not out and absolutely smashes all over the ground. So never trust a politician, Adam. And then we had Simon Kennedy playing. Now, Simon Kennedy is the replacement MP for Scott Morrison. And again, a guy who claimed, played a bit, but not much. He got 47 not out. Again, don't trust those bloody politicians. Unfortunately, we got defeated yesterday. It was utterly shameful.
I have to ask, did you get any? Did you have a good game yourself as skipper?
Look, I got 16 runs. Kieran Gilbert, my great mate, got 17.
Love it.
We were a bit short, and my son Clancy had to play for us. We were short because it was a Monday, a very peculiar day to play, but because of October 7 and the fact it was a Monday meant that I had to call in a family favourite. And so Clancy played, and he got 57 not out. So he was an absolute star, yeah. So very, very proud of him. But otherwise, it was pretty slim pickings for the Press Gallery 11.
And the parliamentarians got the Pete Van Ness trophy, which is again, it's a nice thing that trophy has been struck in Pete's honour, and this game still continues. 40 years on from the Bob Hawke moment in time. If you're listening to this around the world and you've got no idea what we're talking about, it is very much on YouTube. The top edge, infamous top edge. It used to get talked about being a bouncer that hit him. It wasn't quite as you described before. It was the swing of the bat that did him, and so on. And a weirdly important moment in Australian political history. Probe's been wonderful talking to you. As I said before, some of the fondest memories I have from my Canberra days were in your company and down the Werribee end of the Press Gallery, and thrilled to see you doing so well these days at Channel 9. May that Pollies versus Press game continue for many years. I might try and get back for it myself at some point. And, of course, thank you for coming on and joining us late night in Canberra on The Final Word tonight.
You're a good man, Adam. Thank you for having me.
It's the Final Word Cricket Podcast, Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon, as we wind down our weekly show for another week. Should have used a different word there. For another episode.
There's no other week. What, for another 7 days?
I was looking for a synonym.
Una semana más.
We're in season 17 at the moment. What we'll be doing through the rest of the World Cup to show you our workings is we'll have a couple of interviews to drop into the feed. One coming on Friday, which will be quite interesting and quite fun. And then we'll have a lot more of that at the end of the World Cup. And, of course, Jeff and I will be back for Story Time. That will probably come out on Sunday this week. And if you haven't listened to the last Story Time, I thought that was quite good. The one we did before the wedding. I listened back to a little bit of it yesterday. And if you want to catch up on Story Time 203, that was with Jeff and me side by side. We'll be back together again in about 6 weeks from now. And between now and then, Jeff, you'll be mostly on the road, flexing, using a different muscle, writing about politics again.
Yeah, so I'll be here, there, and everywhere over the next few weeks. I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to end up, but it will be where the road decides, and I'll just be trying to stay out of trouble for the most part.
All right, thank you to Ambassador Cruise Line, giving you the chance to cruise with cricket legends this December. Get the discount, go on that cruise for 7 days from the 12th of December. Become a patron. Come to our live show. Get yourself a NordVPN. You know the drill. It's all there. This has been The Final Word, Season 17, Episode 2. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again very, very soon.